Hello there, and thank you so much for joining us in the second of our summer series of webinars focusing on equine mental well-being, brought to you between World Horse Welfare and the University of Nottingham. And this evening, we're going to focus on how to keep horse sport ethical. This is the second of a series of webinars that we started last June. We're just marking time, and I'm very delighted to also welcome those of you joining us on Facebook Live, as well as those of you joining us on Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us for this second in this summer series of webinars on equine mental well-being, which is brought to you between World Horse Welfare and the University of Nottingham. Now, if you've joined us for our webinars before, you'll know the form, but just in case you're new or haven't been many times, just to let you know, this is very much a two-way event. So during the course of the evening, we have one presentation, then a structured Q&A, but later on we will want your questions. And so if you are joining us by Zoom, then please use the Q&A function. By all means, use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves. But if you want a question, please do put it in the Q&A function. It's so much easier to manage. And if you're on Facebook Live, then please put your questions in the comment section. Now, tonight, I am delighted that we have been joined by Professor Madeline Campbell, Professor of Veterinary Ethics at Nottingham Vet School and Senior Lecturer in Ethics and Human-Animal Interaction at the Royal Veterinary College, and also an experienced equine vet, horse owner and breeder. We're also joined by Alex Hua Tian, an experienced and successful event rider, you might know, and also a World Horse Welfare patron, and also by John Burns, one of our field officers and an influential voice for equine welfare within Scotland. So this is very much a two-way thing. If you're joining us on Facebook, then it'd be great if you could share the live video. And just to let you know that all tonight's webinar and all our previous webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So please do, assuming you do enjoy this evening, then please do go back and look at it, but also let your friends and colleagues know about it as well. And we're looking to carry on the webinar series throughout the course of the rest of the year. So if there's something that you think that we should be focusing on as a topic, then please do send through your suggestions to education@worldhorsewelfare.org. So as I've said, Maddie's going to speak to us first for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to have a structured Q&A for about 20 minutes. And then it's very much over to you to ask questions. And I hope you will keep those coming thick and fast. So before we go on, I'm now going to look to share my screen, which, as many of you will know, is a huge challenge for me. But here we go. There we go. How to keep horse sport ethical. And now I just need to go on to the first thing is a poll question. If you're joining us by Facebook, then please do put your answers in the comments section on Facebook. If you're joining us by Zoom, a poll should come up. Have you ever given up on an equestrian activity because of ethical concerns? We're breaking you in gently this evening. Just two options, yes or no. So please, have you ever given up on an equestrian goal because of ethical concerns? So whilst you're going to answer and ponder that question, please, this is an anonymous thing. It's obviously, and it's just as a guide, and it's really just to break the ice for this evening. So please do just respond on that in an anonymous fashion. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about World Horse Welfare, founded in 1927, and very much at the centre of what World Horse Welfare is all about is supporting the horse-human partnership. And obviously, to make it a true partnership, to benefit horses, we have to protect and enhance their welfare. And when we think about welfare, I think too often we think about their physical welfare. But what we do know is that good welfare is as much about their mental well-being as physical welfare. And hence, that's why we're running this series of webinars this summer. And we're delighted to do it in conjunction with the University of Nottingham. I still refer to the University of Nottingham as the new vet school, but it was founded actually in 2006, and many other vet schools have come on stream since then. But there's a lot of innovation in what the University of Nottingham is doing. It has won the Aspire Award in 2016 for student engagement, and the curriculum has an emphasis on handling techniques that promote good equine mental well-being in a veterinary environment. So here to that. Now, before I go on and introduce Maddie, I just wanted to say tonight is all about, the webinars are all about helping us as horse owners. So tonight is about how we can keep horse sport ethical. And what we want to touch upon is the ethics of horse riding and using them in sports. But we also want to ask ourselves, can we enhance equine performance in an ethical way? And when is enough for our horses? So before I introduce Maddie, I just want to ask Basil to give us the answers to the poll question. Look at that. Have you ever given up on an equestrian girl because of ethical concerns? I never thought that question would resonate with Brexit, but the answer is there. 52% for, or yes, 48% against. So that's fascinating. So thank you so much for engaging in that. And now I'm going to introduce you to our main speaker, Professor Madeline Campbell. Maddie was the president of the British Equine Veterinary Association, I think over 10 years ago. I always blame Maddie for, she got me onto the Beaver Council, and I'm now treasurer. So I blame Maddie for that. But on a more serious note, Maddie has been a huge supporter of the charity over many, many years, especially of the charity's founding campaign, which is the End Long Distance Transport of Horses to Slaughter. So Maddie is a great friend personally and to the charity. And one of the things you might not know about Maddie is the fact that during lockdown, she learnt how to play the 5-string banjo. So if I get through all the questions in time, maybe we could have a little bit of 5-string banjo before we end tonight's webinar. Maddie, over to you.
Thank you, Rolly, but I will decline that kind invitation, I think. So I'm just going to actually, first of all, stop my video while I do this, because I'm occasionally dropping you out. So I hope that by stopping my video, I'll improve my bandwidth a little bit, and then I will hopefully share my screen. Are you able to see that okay?
Perfect. You're good to go.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm really, really pleased to be joining this conversation this evening, and grateful for the invitation to do so, because as Rolly mentioned, this whole area around the ethics of using horses and indeed animals more generally in competition is an area which is of great interest to me, not just as an academic question, but also as someone who is involved with horses. So World Horse Welfare really set me these 3 questions to consider tonight, which you can see on the screen there. And I'm going to start with the first of them, which is a kind of overarching question of whether it's ethical to ride horses at all, and then whether it's ethical to use them in sport. And my answer to that is a clear yes. And you might expect that, because as Rolly already mentioned, I've owned horses for decades, I've competed at an amateur level, and I breed horses. So in a way, you'd consider that answer inevitable, but it is an answer which I've come to after a great deal of thought, not only in my role as a horse owner and rider and breeder, but also as a veterinary ethicist, through looking at the question using various ethical theories and frameworks. And I'm just going to explain that to you a little bit more. So my main reason for believing that it is ethical to ride horses and to use them in sport revolves around the fact that really such a use of animals by humans is no different from so many other uses that humans accept. So, and obviously there are always exceptions within society. There will always be some people, for example, who don't agree that we should eat meat, or don't agree that animals should be used in laboratory science. But overall, society allows the use of animals by humans, and that applies across a whole range of things, whether we're talking about our diet, or whether we're talking about medical research, or whether we're talking about using animals to help in the theatre of war, or whether we're talking about keeping animals in zoos as part of conservation programs, and even in fact if we're talking about keeping animals as companions, as pets, because that too is a use of an animal. All of these situations, we're putting animals in a context which would not be their natural context, and we are asking them to behave in certain ways and to perform certain functions for us, for the humans. And I don't see the use of animals in sport as being ethically any different from all of those uses, provided that, and this is a really key point, provided that we always safeguard the welfare of the animals who we're using in sport. So that's really what I've been looking at for a couple of years now, and World Horse Welfare have very kindly funded this research, which has actually been undertaken with my Royal Veterinary College hat on, and we've been developing what we call an ethical framework for the use of horses in sport. In other words, it's essentially a tool which anyone using horses in sport, should they come across some ethical question, and we're going to have lots of those, I'm sure, in the discussion, can use this way of looking at things to help them come to an answer about how they should go forward. And if you're interested in this, I've just put the article reference up there. It's available online, open access, so anyone can just find it easily and read it. So this framework really has three what we call central tenets at the core of it. And these are the things which I think we have to fulfill in order to be able to argue that the use of horses in sport is ethically justifiable. The first of those is that we always have to minimize negative welfare effects and maximize positive welfare effects. And this fits in with what Rolly was just describing about looking for psychological impacts as well as physical impacts. And that comes very much from the work of Professor David Mellor in New Zealand, who you can see here, who developed what's called the 5 domains model along with his co-workers. And what that added to our consideration of welfare over and above the 4 physical components which previous authors had looked at was this idea of the mental state, of how that important that is to animal welfare. And so that's something we have always very much to keep in mind. And then the second thing that I think we absolutely have to do to be able to argue that the use of animals in sport is ethically justifiable is to identify risk and to reduce it where we can. So we need to identify avoidable risk. And having identified it, we need to do what we can to mitigate against it. So that means if we can do that, we can therefore avoid inflicting unnecessary suffering upon animals. Now, in equine sport, as in human sport, there will always be some element of risk that we just can't remove. But our ethical responsibility is to identify the risk which we can remove or at least reduce, and to make sure that we do so. And a good example of this, of course, from the world of eventing is the whole question of rotational falls and the steps which were put in place to try and mitigate against that risk by developing the whole frangible pin system. And when you look at it that way, it's really not very different from what happened in car racing sport some decades ago now. There were a series of really awful accidents, and there's a lot of talk about whether the sport just ought to be discontinued because of them. But instead, they worked very hard to identify where the risks occurred and what they could do to reduce them. And as a consequence, the sport kind of kept its social license and was allowed to continue. And then the other central tenet, which seems like a basic one really, is that we absolutely must make sure we always adhere to the sports regulations or the law. And whilst that seems like a very obvious thing to say, it's sadly still not always the case that those participating in sport do so. And really, again, if we're to keep the social license, in other words, if society is to continue to subscribe to the view that the use of horses in sport is ethical, then we have to make sure that the rules are adhered to and that they're enforced appropriately to make sure that that happens. So I'm going to move on now to the second question about whether we can enhance equine performance in an ethical way. And this I thought was a really interesting question. And it's one that fits very well with the very current subject of sentient animals, of the need to pay due regard to the requirements of sentient animals. So when we talk about sentient, what we mean is animals which are capable of experiencing a life. So it's not just being capable of feeling pain, but again, it's being capable of experiencing positive emotions as well as negative ones. And this is really topical at the moment. And some of you will know that in the UK, there's currently a new animal welfare bill working its way through Parliament, which is focused very much on this so-called recognition of sentience and what needs to exist within the law to make sure that that recognition is protected and occurs. So this whole question of whether we can enhance performance ethically fits very well, I think, into that. And And part of that is that we need to challenge our own traditional ways of doing things. And we need to be looking for evidence about whether or not the way we have always done things actually makes sense, or whether, in fact, with the current state of science, we could be adapting things to improve those experiences of horses. And so one of the questions that has been kind of puzzling me over recent years is the whole question of the use of double bridles. And some of you will know that in the UK, currently you are allowed to ride at Grand Prix level in a snaffle bridle. It's not a requirement to use a double bridle, whereas in some, not all, but some high-level international competitions, it's still a requirement to have a double bridle at Grand Prix level. And that anomaly in the regulations has kind of been puzzling me, and I've been wondering about why that exists and whether it's justified and whether we should be insisting that a double bridle be used, or in fact, would it be better to just use a simpler bitting arrangement? Now, we probably don't have the answer to that yet, because I'm not sure, someone may correct me in the question session, but I'm not aware at least of any significant number of studies that have been done on this to look at the effects from the horse's point of view of being ridden in a double bridle compared to a snaffle bridle, as that impacts upon welfare. And of course, there will be a lot of variables, such as the rider and the horse and so on and so forth. But I think it's worth considering and wondering about, at least. And what I don't think we should do is just kind of brush those questions away. So I remember having been at a conference once and hearing someone ask this question about why double bridles were obligatory, and a panelist said, oh, well, a large part of it really is to test the skill of the rider. And that, to my mind, makes no sense, because I mean, the ultimate skill of the rider, of course, would be to have no tack whatsoever and see whether you can still do your dressage test. So we just need to be considering why we're doing what we've always done and whether it's a sensible thing to be doing in light of current evidence. And on the right here, I've just picked up a random advertising picture. And of course, there are many different types of bridle available, made by many different manufacturers. But the point was really just to say that there's been some very good work in recent years looking at the fit of bridles and the way in which they conform to the horse's head and how that can impact upon the horse's experience and how much comfort it feels. And when we look at all of those kind of things, then the answer to the question of whether we can enhance equine performance in an ethical way seems to me to be kind of obvious, in the sense that everything we do to improve welfare seems to me to be bound to enhance performance. Improved performance is kind of a lucky and positive byproduct often of improving welfare. And any of you who, like me, have, in your younger years kind of competed in some athletic endeavor, will know that, how much difference it makes if you've had a good night's sleep, if you've moved around a bit before you get to the running track, whether you've eaten well. All of those kind of things have a massive impact on your performance. And I'm sure there's, must be true of horses and indeed of canine athletes as well. If we turn horses out so that they can move around a lot, so that they can exercise, build up their muscles, develop their proprioception, all of those things, that's bound to have a positive impact ultimately upon their performance. And, if we do some of our training out hacking, up and down the hills on different terrain, again, that will help to build their strength, and it will protect them against injury. And ultimately, all of that is likely to enhance performance, because they're less likely to get injured than if they're just doing something very repetitive on the same surface over and over again. And so at the same time as increasing positive welfare, particularly mental welfare, we're also having a positive effect upon performance. And I mentioned briefly already transport. There's been some really interesting work on this in recent years, and I've just put an example of it up here, looking at how transport may affect physiological state of horses. And as you can see from the bit I've just highlighted, that suggests that having adequate space and rear-facing positions means the horse can balance better, and that in turn may enhance the health and welfare. And it doesn't take a genius then to work out that, therefore, if you travel your horse in the way which it enhances health and welfare, it's likely to arrive at the competition feeling less stressed and less tired, and therefore its performance is going to be enhanced. I think also we need to think very carefully about behavioural indicators, and there's been a lot of work on this in recent years, and I've just put one example from one group up here, but several groups have been looking at facial expressions in horses and in fact at behaviours more generally when they're being ridden, and how we can recognise what those mean and what they tell us about the horse's mental as well as its physical state. And I think that is something that all of us working with horses need to educate ourselves about. It sometimes seems quite intuitive, but it's important to make sure that we really do understand the science behind it, and that we use that to inform our decisions about the way in which we're training horses and just the way in which we're managing them generally. And again, by doing all of that, we improve welfare and we also improve performance. And then finally, I think it is really important as well to treat horses as individuals. So we can make sweeping generalizations based in the science, like, you know, horses should be turned out for at least a period of free exercise each day. And I think most people nowadays would agree upon that for competition horses, although of course, you know, certainly 10, possibly 5 years ago, that absolutely would not have been the perceived wisdom, because there's always been this concern about the risk of injury and kind of balancing that against the benefits of turning the horse out. And we have come to understand more and more over the years that there are physical benefits as well as psychological benefits to horses for being turned out. But nonetheless, we always have to adapt those kind of generalizations from the science to individuals. So if, for example, you know, in my situation, we've occasionally had horses come in to stand at stud stallions who have been competition horses, and they haven't been used to being turned out for long periods of time, at least. For them, potentially just kind of throwing them in a field for a long day can be quite stressful. And so we need to take account of their history, and we need to introduce them to that routine gradually and allow them to kind of build up confidence in it. So it really comes back to the same thing of just being aware of the horse's needs, of what the horse is telling you through the facial expressions and the behavior, and of trying to accommodate their individual needs where we can do so. And then finally, the third question I was asked to consider was this question of when enough is enough. And one answer to that I've already touched upon. It's quite obvious. We must adhere to the rules, and if we don't do so, then clearly that's just ethically unacceptable. You know, there's a reason the rules are there and they have to be adhered to, and that's kind of end of as far as that goes. So enough is absolutely enough when rules are being broken. But there's a much bigger and in a way more interesting question, I think, about identifying things which are currently still allowed under the rules, but which nonetheless, with our current state of knowledge, we probably need to be reconsidering. So an example of this having happened over recent years is the whole question of trimming horses' muzzle whiskers. And certainly when I used to do a bit of showing when I was younger, it was absolutely the norm to trim the horse's head, you know, to try and create this very refined look. And that has been true in many disciplines, not just in the showing world. But recently, the FEI has brought in a ruling about this, actually banning it. And the reason that ruling has been brought in is that our scientific understanding has really changed over the years, so that we now do understand, and it all comes back to this idea of sentient animals, that horses use those whiskers on their muzzles for sensation, to work out what's going on in the environment around them. And that's really important to the horse from both a physical and a psychological point of view. And by trimming them off simply to make the horse look what in our opinion is smart, we can be having a detrimental effect on welfare. So that's a good example of the way in which kind of what has been going on for years was examined and challenged, and then the rule has been changed. And there are other things going on at the moment. For example, quite a topical one has been the ratio of body weight of the rider and the horse, and there have been a lot of different groups looking at that. I've just put one example up on the slide here for you. And certainly in the showing world, for example, I know there's been some chat in recent weeks in the press about the question of adults riding in ponies on showgrounds and whether or not that should be allowed. And then we can all think of things within our own disciplines which are currently allowed under the rules, but which actually, if we stop to think about it, we might question. And that, I think, is where the challenge is to all of us, really, to be looking at what we're doing, trying to see it from the horse's point of view insofar as we understand their needs, both physical and psychological, and then working out, using whatever tools we have available to us to work out whether what we're doing is actually reasonable and ethically justifiable, or whether we need to be changing something. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm going to look forward very much now to hearing from Alex and John of their experiences around these areas.
Maddie, thank you very much. I was just starting to look at the questions that are coming through. Normally I have to ask people to put questions in the Q&A function, and you're already doing it. So that is really good. And also just to note that there is a upvoting. So by all means, put in a question in the Q&A function of Zoom if you're on Zoom, or in the comments function on Facebook. But if you're in Zoom, you can upvote a question. So if there's one question that's very similar to what you're going to ask, rather than write your own questions, please do just upvote it. I should have said in my introductory comments that our next webinar is going to be next month on July the 28th at 7 p.m. And that's going to be focusing on how to restrain horses appropriately. And we're very fortunate, we're going to be joined by Dr. Gemma Pearson, equine vet from the University of Edinburgh and Director of Equine Behaviour at the Horse Trust, Brad Hill, an equine vet from the vet school at Nottingham, who has a particular interest in equine behaviour and how to handle and restrain horses humanely and effectively, and our own Tony Evans, one of our field officers and one of John's colleagues and friends. So Maddie, listen, thank you. As I've said, loads of questions already coming in, which is wonderful. Now, before I hand over to introduce our next two panelists, or two panelists who are going to join Maddie now, I just wanted to ask a second poll question. This is a multiple choice question, so you can answer as many as appropriate. Have you ever called out unethical practice involving horses, and if so, how? And there's a number of options here. Yes, I talked to the person in charge or the event organizer. Yes, I wrote to an individual or an organization or press. Yes, I posted it on social media. Yes, I took a course of action not listed here. Or no, I have seen other ethical practice but never called it out. Or no, I have never seen unethical practice. So whilst you're pondering that, I now need to realize that I should have shared my screen again, which I will do once I've found the relevant slide. There we go, share. And whilst you're answering that, I'm going to introduce you to our other two panelists. There you go. There's the poll question. Have you ever called out unethical practice involving horses? And if so, how? And now to introduce you to panelist Alex Hua Tian, who's a great friend of the charity as well. He is a patron of World Horse Welfare, which I know resides along the fact that he was the first athlete to represent China in eventing back in the Beijing Olympics in Hong Kong back in 2008. Alex is hopefully, well, will be going to the Tokyo Olympics very shortly, and we wish him all the very best for that. But a quirky fact that you might not know about Alex is that during lockdown, he has turned his hand to cooking and now cooks a very good Hainan chicken rice. Poached chicken, seasoned rice, served with chili sauce and cucumber garnish. We could stop the webinar and go out and have something to eat that right now, but that's great. And also then to introduce our other panelist, which is World Horse Welfare, John Burns, who's been with the charity since 2009. Previous with that, he was with the Scottish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And John is very active in the whole equestrian scene in Scotland, not least because of his children. His daughter, who's now 19, has competed in eventing up to a very high level, representing Lanarkshire and Renfrewshire Pony Club in all disciplines as well. And his son, who's just turning 13, has done all Pony Club teams, planning to do some British eventing now too. So, you know, he lives and breathes horses. But when he's not living and breathing horses, he is undefeated in the sack race through school as a pupil, and now also as a parent in the dreaded father's sack race. One thing worse than facing the West Indies fast bowler or Spain in football would be facing up to John Burns in a sack race. I'm interested, I wonder if during lockdown, in keeping with the other panelists, John has been just refining his skills when it comes to the sack race. Not that they need any refining. Brilliant. Well, listen, a great welcome to all three of you. Thank you again for joining us. And we're just going to have a bit of a structured session of a Q&A before we go to a sort of open Q&A. And in the first bit, I just want to, under what circumstances might we be asking too much of our horses, which is sort of very much picked up within Maddie's presentation. So, John, if I could come to you first, are there certain horse and rider combinations that are unfair on the horse?
Well, I suppose the most obvious one is the overweight rider. That always springs to mind first and foremost. The overweight rider and overweight horse is a literally combination made from hell. So it's got significant health and welfare problems for the horse. You need to be appropriately matched for the horse you've got. The large adults riding kids' ponies, Madeline touched on that as well. The Great Yorkshire Show's been very good at essentially stamping that out and stopping people competing. Have a realistic view of what your horse is bred for. I think that's very important. What its athletic ability is going to be. What you would like to do with your horse. Do you want to event? Do you want to hack? What's the thing you want to do most? And then try and select the right type of horse for whatever you want to actually compete at. So essentially, you don't want a nice steady cob it's never going to make a 4-star eventer because it just doesn't have the athletic ability. I think probably the biggest thing as well is also the fitness of the horse and rider combination can be a huge factor. People that don't have their horse fit enough for what they think they want to be able to do, and also are they fit enough to do the competition themselves? Because as the competition goes on, they get more tired and sit on the horse's back more and more.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Yeah, well, you picked up on a number of different things there, which we may well come back to shortly. Alex, if I could turn to you then. Obviously, transporting horses, in all disciplines can involve extensive travelling. Do you think extensive travelling and frequent competitions are detrimental to equine welfare?
I think extensive travelling can certainly be a welfare issue, but it doesn't have to be. I think it depends very much on how it is that you're managing your horses, that you're traveling certain distances. Also, I think it depends a lot on how used to those horses are to traveling longer distances with, for example, high-level show jumpers, less so eventers, but in higher level eventing, we do travel around Europe at times. The horses do become more and more accustomed throughout their career to traveling further. But having said that, there are ways and means that we can manage their welfare throughout, making sure that they're hydrated, making sure that obviously you're carrying enough water, that you're not traveling too far day in, day out. Nowadays, there's a great network of transporting stables throughout Europe that you can drive 5-6 hours between stops, stable the night, somewhere comfortable for the horse, and then carry on. Obviously, then there are also concerns, certainly from this year, post EHV, the outbreak this spring in terms of biosecurity, but these are all things that you have to balance. This summer, of course, we have the Tokyo Olympics. The horses do have quite a long flight out to Tokyo. But then again, as a community at the top level of the sport, I think we are very, very good now at managing the horses' welfare and ability to travel those distances.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Alex. And I know we'll come back to that shortly. Sorry, I'll give Basil fair warning because I didn't give you the poll question answers. So we'll come back to that. We'll get after I've asked Maddie a question. Maddie, you picked up around sort of performance enhancing measures within the rules, and you said absolutely there can be performance enhancing measures within the rules that improve welfare, fitness being an example. What about issues like soft palate surgery, joint medications? When things are a bit closer to the outside of the envelope, where do you think it's right to draw the line in those kind of those kind of developments over the years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's something which I think vets are increasingly looking at, again, kind of challenging our own practice and whether what we've always done is indeed the right thing to be doing. And it comes somewhat to John's point, doesn't it, about whether the horse, what job the horse is really designed to do, and how far it is reasonable to expect it to go. And I think we have to always be working within the horse's kind of physical and mental limitations. And then of course there are other questions, and I can see some of these have come up in the Q&A as well about many other things which are currently allowed under the rules, but I think we're increasingly questioning. So the whip across a number of disciplines is an obvious example of that. The use of spurs, again, why is it required to use spurs at certain high-level dressage competitions? What are we trying to achieve by doing so? And then I actually kind of flip it the other way around a bit as well, and saying, why are we not allowed to do certain things? So for example, why are you not meant to use the voice in a dressage test? What is bad about communicating with your horse via the voice? So again, maybe that's the kind of thing we need to start to look at more. And shoeing, weighted boots, all of those kind of issues are things we probably need to be reconsidering, I think.
And it's probably fair to say, and maybe we'll come back to this in the Q&A as well, the fact that actually equestrian sport now, it matters how it looks as well as to what.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it does, absolutely. But I would also say I don't think that should be our prime motivation for changing things. I think our prime motivation should absolutely be because we're all passionate about horses and we all want to do our best by them, and I'm sure that is true of the vast majority of people. It's just that we don't always stop to consider whether that is what we're actually doing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, very fair point. Then if we just move it on and to when is enough? And Alex, what might indicate to you that a horse has had enough during a training session, or sort of if you're preparing it with a particular goal in mind? What are the indicators for you where a horse has had enough?
I think there are obviously the physical indicators, which I think most riders of all experience, higher experience and lower experience, would be able to see, the horse being tired, the horse refusing to continue, etc., etc. I think the things that are more nuanced and I think more interesting are the mental questions that we ask the horses and how able to answer them the horses are. Time after time after time. I think when you look at the intensity of dressage tests or show jumping rounds or cross-country courses, I think as riders, we have to consistently ask ourselves the question, not only is our horse fit enough to jump around this cross-country course, or not only is our horse talented enough and trained well enough to jump the height of the fences, is the horse able to answer those questions that's being put in front of it and continue to gain in confidence? And I think for more experienced riders, this is where more experienced riders are able to have that intuition that actually this horse is ready for that challenge, or maybe this horse isn't quite ready for that challenge. And I think that is I think going forwards a more interesting question.
Yeah, very good point. Now I've forgotten again. Basil, poll results. Could you please give us the poll results? We'll put everyone out of misery. Well, look at that. That's brilliant. So half of people have talked to the person in charge or an event organizer, and then a quarter have said, yes, I took a course of action not listed here. So that's brilliant. And I have seen 26%, I've seen unethical practice, but never called it out. And it will be really interesting, because we'll touch on that shortly about it and how people might do it. So thank you. That's a really interesting range of responses there. John, if I can then just pick up on the back of Alex's question, about, when is enough sort of during its lifetime? If a horse's performance or attitude changes, what do you think riders should do?
I think riders need to be more educated, and that's across the board, not just in the horse's performance. I'm going to go back a wee bit before I go forward. So Alex talked about the travelling. A seasoned campaigner like him, he's got all the experience in the world, a good team with him. He's considered everything. But a lower level, you'll probably see more problems because the horse is in a grass diet. Person decides they're going to go to a competition. They've turned our horse's diet upside down in 2 days. It's got the stress of being away. It's got the stress of strange surroundings. That also falls into place on what your question you asked there. So I think everybody needs a little bit of help, whether that's a coach, a qualified coach, trainer, something you can go to look and ask for help with your horse. I think there needs to be more funding put towards quality coaches that people can go to and ask for help. If their horse is starting to do things, it could be something quite simple, quite an easy fix, but it takes maybe a more experienced eye to see that. And if you're quite new to the horse game, the most simplest thing can be, you can be oblivious to it. So
yeah, brilliant. But Maddie, I think you're in luck tonight because there's so many questions coming through. We're not going to have enough time for any banjo playing. But it's lovely to see so many people joining us from across the UK, but Armenia, Croatia, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, the USA, just to name a few. Maddie, rather relating to the previous question, but moving on to when is enough, can veterinary interventions aimed at keeping a horse sound be unethical?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that there's been a lot of discussion about over recent years. And as you'll know, there was a whole session on that at the British Equine Veterinary Association Congress a few years ago. And it's a complicated question, isn't it? Because sometimes we need to provide pain relief, and there's the kind of whole question about, is it reasonable to do that intermittently in order that a horse carries on having a life which we hope, taken across its lifespan, is a positive experience for that animal? Or are we saying that it's really not reasonable to do that? And if that is our belief, then, as you just asked, John, what happens to the horse then? And then we need to make sure it has a happy retirement or it's otherwise taken good care of. So it's a very difficult question, and it's difficult also because we tend to draw analogies with human sport, and in all sport, injuries are inevitable, and it's common in human sport as well for those injuries to be treated and medicated in order to keep that person competing. But the key difference, of course, is that, and again, this is a nuanced statement, and it's not as straightforward as it seems, but generally speaking, human athletes are consenting to be participating, whereas horse athletes are not. We're asking them to do that. And that, I think, does put a particular responsibility upon all of us, vets, but also owners, riders, managers, so on and so forth, to make sure that we really are making decisions in the horse's best interests. But I'd be very interested to hear from the others about, how you deal with those kind of pressures when you've got a big competition coming up and how you balance that.
Alex, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a very important line to be drawn when you're looking at a horse in sport and managing its soundness and mental well-being and its long-term welfare, between managing the horse's intermittent discomfort, perhaps whether that's pain medication or a joint treatment or any of the hundreds of thousands of treatments that modern vets now have in their books, and one that will obviously allow that horse to continue to perform and compete and be fulfilled and enjoy its career. But I think the important thing is in that treatment, you're not looking to treat the horse with it having a risk of a further injury, which I think with some treatments and in certain scenarios, there is that risk. Yeah. And I think as long as when you're providing pain relief, but then not expecting that tendon to rupture or whatever and then galloping it, I think that's fine. If you're treating an animal for pain and with the knowledge that there is a serious injury down the road, then I think that is an issue. And I think if you are constantly propping up a horse that has long-term soundness issues, I think there are questions there as well.
Yeah, I think that's a point really well made, absolutely, and that's something we always need to be thinking of. And of course, it's not only soundness issues, is it? We're talking about, and when you were talking earlier, Alex, about transportation and the stress that can cause, and you'll know that in some horse sports the use of a particular drug which helps to control the development of gastric ulcers is allowed during competition, and in others it's not. And I mean, that to me is a very intriguing issue. If we have a horse which develops gastric ulcers as a result of the stress associated with being transported to events, what is in the horse's best interest? Is it then to treat it for those ulcers, or should we be saying no, we must compete free of medication? Or do we just kind of say, well, then that the horse can't compete then if it can't travel without developing ulcers? So it's quite complicated sometimes.
Yeah. There's quite a few questions about that as well, aren't there? So let's move it on to factors that may influence the ethical treatment of horses. And John, the first question is around social media, and I can see a few questions around this as well. But some humorous social media posts frame horses as stupid or calculating rather than inadequately trained. Could this encourage, in your view, undesirable attitudes, or is it just a bit of light-hearted fun?
Well, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. So
sorry.
What I did was I thought I'll phone a friend, because I'm not actually a great social media person. I'm not even on it. So I took some advice from some experts. I've got 2 teenage children, as you said earlier on. So I spoke to them, and they assured me that generally most of these social media outlets with stuff like that, the riders are essentially poking fun at themselves, at their own inadequacies of their riding abilities, and the horse isn't essentially the target within this. It's really just, look how bad a rider I am.
Interesting.
Whether we learn anything from it, I don't know, but I don't think it's targeting the horse in any way.
Interesting. Okay, that's right. Well, I know we're going to come back to social media in a second. Alex, how can riders who are aiming at a big goal keep their horse's well-being at the forefront of their minds?
Well, I think the simple thing is that the horse's well-being is part of preparing your horse for a big goal. As Maddie said in her presentation, good welfare, performance is an outcome of good welfare. And I think if you look at top horses competing across all disciplines, you can't possibly look to be competitive. You can't possibly look to be winning unless your horse is well as being fit. And when I say well, that I think nowadays that very much encompasses the horse's mental well-being as well.
Absolutely. No, very good point. And again, I know there's a few questions about that too. Maddie, then I'm asking you all the tricky questions. Do the financial interests influence how ethically horses are managed and treated?
I mean, there's certainly the potential for them to do so, but I guess that's a kind of a potential that cuts both ways, isn't it? So, to a certain extent, financial interests, in keeping the horse on the road and getting it to that big competition and so forth may put pressure upon trainers and riders and vets to do all the kind of things we were just talking about in terms of treatments. But I suppose you could flip it on its head and say, but where someone has money invested in a horse and they're prepared to spend money on really good veterinary treatments across its lifetime, exactly as Alex was just describing. And I guess that's particularly important, isn't it, Alex, in the disciplines which it takes a long while to get the horse to the really elite level of which yours is one of course. Then I guess financial interest can have a positive effect as well.
Brilliant. And then before I open it up to the monster number of questions we've got coming in, just picking up on the poll question and calling out unethical treatment of horses. Alex, in your view, should one call out unethical practices if someone sees them?
Gosh, this is a really difficult one. I mean, I can totally see both sides of the coin. When we're talking, let's take, for example, the rider's weight versus the horse's welfare. That's an impossible question to answer in a simple and easy way, because how do you reconcile the two things? The horse's welfare, and also fat shaming somebody who perhaps is not appropriate to ride that horse. In my opinion, as a community, as horse lovers, obviously the horse welfare comes first, but I think how we handle that situation is really important. And in terms of an ethical framework and the work that Maddie's doing, I think that's really important, to give the community some kind of benchmark on how it is that we handle situations like that. Another situation that I think we come across more often than I guess surprisingly often is teaching lessons for perhaps more amateur clients, less experienced clients, and people turning up with their horses with either low-grade lamenesses or perhaps more progressed lamenesses that the owners or the riders have not noticed. And I would say quite a lot of horses turn up for lessons, and talking to friends and other riders and coaches, I think this is very much something that is quite prevalent. And it's not just the issue that the horse is lame, because obviously there's ways to hopefully solve that situation. But more often than not, as a trainer, when you quite often you feel, when you mention this to the student or the client, quite a lot of amateur clients would take it as a criticism of the horse or themselves, that the horse is lame. Certainly not take the advice or the pointer in a positive way. And I think that's something that needs discussing a little bit further, and how it is that we address that question of how to approach it.
Brilliant. So, John, if I come to you, I mean, obviously, Alex has sort of looked at it from not all elite, because as we've talked about some of the clients he's got who are coming for training sessions. But from your perspective, especially within the World Horse Welfare and Pony Club perspective, should unethical practices be called out?
I think they should be, and I think there's a way to go about it. As an example, BE, I think, are really good. BE stewards will stop riders if they think they're unsafe, or if they think the combination's going to be a disaster, which is good. Pony Club as well, they need to be a combination signed off by their DC, essentially, if they're fit to be able to go and do it. But coaches have to be able to intervene, and people have to be more receptive to it. If Alex tells you your horse is lame, my initial reaction would be, okay, I'm going to phone the vet and we'll get it assessed. Not come back at him with, oh, I'm not really happy, it's an offence. Horses can go looking quite sound and essentially come off the box after standing on itself lame. So we have to be mindful to people's emotions, but we also have to tackle the head on, as if there's something wrong with the horse. Again, Great Yorkshire, I mentioned them already. They've got a policy where you're not allowed to have adults riding kids' ponies, essentially, firstmans, and they've been quite ruthless about doing it. So it's just about building momentum behind these things and trying to do it. I suppose I probably wouldn't step in if I was in the flashing lane at Appleby to tell them it was inappropriate, but there's a balance to be had.
Yeah. So it's a really good point around the balance. And Maddie, from your perspective, just thinking, how is it, assuming we're saying yes, it is right, and I think both Alex and John are saying yes, it is right, but we need to do it in probably in a constructive way. How can we achieve that?
Well, I think there's a role to play, as Alex already described, for the people at the elite level of the sport in helping to promote that kind of attitude, certainly, and in encouraging people to think about the best interests of their horse, because we do sometimes come up against conflicts between the interests of the riders and the interests of the horse, and so it really helps to have people like Alex and John, explaining why our ethical responsibility is to always put the interests of the horse first. And then I think probably just trying to do it as much as is possible in a way that isn't personal. So, as John said, it helps once you get momentum behind something, then it's not that one overweight person being picked on for riding horses which is too small for them. It's a kind of general increase in understanding that this is a problem, and it's something which is going to be addressed across the board, and it's going to be addressed by regulatory bodies, by organisers, and so on and so forth, not just by individuals choosing to post on social media. My personal view would be that that's not very constructive.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, listen, talking about the Three Peaks Challenge, I feel that we're at the bottom of Ben Nevis, Scarfell and Snowdonia all at the same time with the number of questions that are coming in. So we'll kick on in, and do remember you can upvote any of the questions that are there. So the first question is, should we be reconsidering the age at which it is acceptable to race or compete young horses? That's from Dorothy. Maddie, I'll come to you on that one.
So, as you know, this is something which has been a question which has kind of come up in the course of our research over the last few months. And I think it's certainly something we need to consider, and we probably need to accumulate evidence around it. So I think probably a lot of people across disciplines wonder about whether that is the best thing to be doing, to be competing horses at a young age. And there is some evidence on it, particularly with race horses. There's much less evidence about the impact, for example, of young horse classes in disciplines such as dressage and eventing, and whether, pushing horses early on actually means that they don't have such a long career as they might otherwise have done. And I think we simply don't know the answer to that. So I definitely think it's something we need to be looking at, and I think it's something we need to be building an evidence base on.
Brilliant, thank you. Alex, there's a question for Maya on breeding. What responsibility have breeders when it comes to breeding horses that are aesthetically and beautiful, long legs, natural showy gaits, but at the same time anatomically and biomechanically compromised by, for example, being hypermobile, having short saddle support area, legs too long, making them look like giraffe grazing and developing incorrectly because of that, not to mention the whole miniature horse industry. So about what responsibility have breeders here?
I think breeders have a responsibility to breed horses that have a lifelong use, and part of that lifelong use is soundness, and I think sadly, obviously, if you have a mare that you adore, that's competed to a certain level, but then not proven to be sound enough to continue to compete, you see many owners who decide to breed from that mare, whether or not the issues that mare has had are congenitive and might be passed on to offspring and progeny in the future. And I think making sure that you are breeding viable horses for the future is a really important responsibility for the breeders. I'm not a breeder myself, but I think there are professional studs that do a great job, that breed lovely horses for the market and are very thoughtful in how it is that they, what brood mares they're using first of all, and how they match them up, and etc., etc. But I think, especially here in the UK, we have a large number of hobby breeders, maybe one mare breeder or an owner that jumps into breeding because really that's the only viable option for that mare going forwards. And I think there needs to be a huge amount more thought going into whether actually that is the right thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. John, there's quite a few questions. Tina and Kate have asked about spurs. Is it ethical? Should they be banned? And actually, Tina's saying she's not obviously talking about railed or electric spurs, which of course should be banned, but just normal spurs. Is it ethical in your view that they should be used? Obviously, Maddie touched on this earlier.
I don't think they should be banned, personally. It's back to horses for courses, if I'm honest. The pet hate I always see as a child with a 3-ring gag in the pony's mouth and a set of spurs, and you think, what are you doing? So I think in the right circumstances, in the right, well, not pair of hands, but the right heels, a set of spurs can be a good aid, but it needs to be by someone that's been either, if it's a child, signed off that they're allowed to use them, or be an adult that actually understands what the use of the spur is, as opposed to just a blanket across the board.
Brilliant.
Roland, could I possibly just pick up on that a minute? Because I think it goes to something that I can see has come up in the chat as well, which is, and Johnny is quite right at all, of course, with many of these aids and double bridles and so forth, the impact they have is very dependent upon the person using them. And so we need to somehow take account of that as well, I think. Blanket bans aren't necessarily the answer. It's just that we need to be thinking about their use more carefully.
Yes, and I think for charity generally is banning anything tends to drive it underground, and actually sometimes it's better to have it there where you can regulate. But I completely appreciate that for some it's quite a
education really is first and foremost for a lot of these things, to people to understand how the horse should be bitted or what's suitable for the horse, and there's so many factors.
Yeah. Brilliant. Maddie, Julie's asked, what are your views on horses being stabled or grazed without company? And do you think it will ever be illegal to do so in the UK?
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, there is some international legislation on this, and we know that horses, generally speaking, are herd animals. So, again, I think it's another area where we need to be looking very hard at the evidence. And overall, if we're trying to fulfill the horse's need to be able to display normal behaviors and to kind of replicate a natural life for them as much as possible for all of the reasons which we discussed, then one would assume it's better for them to be grazing with company. Having said that, of course, there are individuals, and I have one of these myself, who are just so horrible to other horses that they actually can't be in the same field as other horses. And then we have to work around that and find a way of having them, on the other side of a safe fence and so on and so forth. So, but generally speaking, I think that's the direction we should be going in, yeah.
And I might second Maddie quickly on that as well. I also have a horse, actually, my top horse that I took to Rio, who is horrible to other horses, and I wouldn't dare, for equal welfare reasons, put another horse in a field with him. And in fact, actually, he is quite comfortable and very, very happy being out in the field totally by himself without anybody else in view, which is very rare. That is not a normal situation with a horse at all. But I would be in agreement with John and Maddie that sweeping bans on certain management is not always the easiest answer, because as we know with horses, that sweeping ban may not suit 10% of horses. And I think ultimately there has to be some response. We need to find measures that put the responsibility for those decisions on the people managing those horses.
Yes, it's the outcome. It's the outcome that matters, isn't it? And as Maddie says, horses are individuals, and as John says, it's horses for courses. Another question from Maya. Alex, in your opinion, how much of the ethical issues are caused by lack of knowledge on part of the riders, trainers, or handlers, making them less culpable because they did not know that what they're doing was wrong?
I would say, I mean, it's very difficult to quantify it, but in my experience, 90% is lack of knowledge and lack of experience. it really is very rare to come across a situation in the horse sport world, certainly in the higher levels of the horse sport world, where potential conflicts of interest, financial interests, competitive interests do come so into conflict with welfare that it is a serious concern. Obviously, it does happen from time to time, but I would say the vast majority of numbers are lack of experience and lack of knowledge.
Yeah, brilliant. Maddie, I recognise the question who has just given us this question. Is it justifiable to use a whip as a reminder or encouragement to maintain speed at the end of an event when the horse is slowing down?
It's a thorny issue, isn't it? Absolutely, across disciplines. And there's been some interesting research on it, because in fact it's not even proven that using the whip does maintain speed. In fact, there was one study I remember when using the whip seemed to slow the horses down, if anything, but that may have been that those horses were already slowing around and so got whipped more. So yeah, the evidence is somewhat confused on it. My personal view on this would be no. I can't see an ethical argument in favor of doing that, and that is completely a personal view. I absolutely, as a rider, and someone who handles breeding stallions, for example, absolutely accept the argument that we need many times, I would say most of the time actually, to be carrying a whip for safety reasons. So I think carrying of a whip, is not to be discouraged, because I think it can improve welfare of both horse and rider through making safety more likely to be kept. But my personal view is that using it for so-called encouragement, I can't find an ethical justification for.
Brilliant. Thank you. John, there's a question here from Jane, who's a carriage driver. It's quite I'll try and summarize it. I mean, but she's a carriage driver, does a lot of competing, and they take some basically portable stabling with them. Many of us also employ electric fence compounds to give our equines a bit of extra room by necessity. It makes it easier for newcomers to the sport, as you can use an electric fence compound even if you have no stabling. However, what has concerned her over the last few years has been very restricted to space that's available. Most events stipulate 10 by 10, regardless of the size of the horse. It's got to be electrified and also have rubber matting on the floor, and she feels this has welfare implications. My driving pony is only 14.1, but I wouldn't expect him to spend most of the 3 days in an electrified area of that size. He would be stressed. What are your thoughts on that? There's quite a lot in that question.
There's quite a lot in that question. Essentially, you've got a small area, about 10 by 10, the pony has to be kept in.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit small, to be honest. I don't know if they can get out and hand graze, walk them out. I don't think it's a long-term option for keeping it in. I'm not just sure the makeup of it. Obviously, the horse will be coming out to be driven, but most of the time, when I'm at events, whether that's generally BE stuff like that, they're very good. There's usually more than ample space to go out and hand graze at various events, and get that opportunity to let the horse walk out, have a graze, a bit of normality. But it sounds a very tight situation if it's constant.
Yeah, so obviously these events are going on a number of days. Jane, I hope we've sort of broadly answered that, but do come back if we haven't. Alex, you'll like this question from Gillian Keegan. If we as equestrians are feeling that something which is allowed under the rules shouldn't be allowed, shouldn't we be demanding quicker action and more flexibility from those who set the rules and regulate the sport?
Oh, okay. Yes, I probably agree with that statement. However, sadly, that's not often how the world works. Certainly when you're talking about horse sport, you're talking about your national federations. So for me, it's the Chinese Equestrian Association in China. Here it's the British Equestrian Federation or the member bodies. And then they feed up into the FEI for international sport. Decision-making on many of these issues are complex. Certainly once you are reaching up to FEI level decisions, the decisions they make have to be, and the rules that they make have to be as relevant for developing sporting nations like equestrian sporting nations like China as they are here in the UK, where the sport is very much sewn into the fabric of society. And so huge number of considerations have to be made, and that decision-making process is slow and at times ponderous. And sometimes it needs to be ponderous because we don't want, equally on the other side of the coin, don't want knee-jerk reactions that are not thought through. So, you know, certainly, Roly, you work very closely with the FEI as well on many of these things. I think the important thing is that we continually have these conversations. And I think on the vast number of situations, they've improved and improved quickly, certainly within what is, I think, possible.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Maddie, Lisa Ashton, who we know well, she's asked a series of questions around the work you're doing at the RBC. Social license of equestrian sports is earned by all of us doing the next right thing. She's asked, your latest paper explains a process with recognition of dissenting opinions. How is your ethical framework, or how is the ethical framework in practice, or in terms of how it's applied, different to justification?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I guess what's different about it is that it does recognize exactly what you've just described in the question, which is that when we have a group of people looking at a question, there are bound to be within that group dissenting opinions. And you know, very often in ethics, there's not a right answer and a wrong answer. There are lots of nuanced ways of looking at it. So I guess what the framework hopefully enables people to do is to look at the question, to take into account all those different opinions, to kind of judge them or weigh them up against those three key things I talked about trying to always minimize negative welfare effects and maximize positive ones, and making sure we reduce avoidable risk and always, you know, adhering to the regulations. And then by doing that process, it kind of says, okay, well, actually, when we look at those core ideas, we can see that this opinion is probably the way we need to go. And so hopefully the point of the framework really is to enable people to reach a consensus opinion. So it very much recognizes that there will be different points of view, and it hopefully just provides a tool which will enable groups of people to find a way forward together, kind of having signed up to those central ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Dorothy said, is the ethical issue with respect to double or snaffle bridles to do with how they are used rather than what they are used? And I think we sort of touched on that already, haven't we? Jennifer said, I'm so glad, Maddie, you mentioned the use of the voice. My daughter asked just this recently as she wished to try dressage test online. It put her off competing. John, Jennifer's also asked, her concern remains the noseband. After a lot of flurry, discussion has gone very quiet and nothing seems to have changed. In your experience, how big a issue is tight nosebands and sort of over-aggressive nosebands?
Something that actually gets checked quite often now, actually, at events. Something I've had experience of, nosebands being checked at events. There's always development. I think we always have to aim that we've got what is good welfare, because it's an evolving issue. I think some of the stuff that Russell Grad did for the girths and reshaping and things like that, I think, I'm not naming names, Fairfax did quite a lot with the bridle as well, but it's definitely an evolving game, and we have to keep moving with the times. And what was all right 20 years ago isn't all right now. We have to think of the horse-human partnership and what it really means and how we take it forward. And if we think something's detrimental to the horse that maybe helps the rider, well, it'll just have to change.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, John. Alex, Kate's asked, within sport, do we ask ourselves enough about whether the horse is having a positive emotional experience? She says, don't get me wrong, I'm not against sport completely, but I do think we need to be asking ourselves what's in it for them as well as for us, as they can't simply be facilitators of our fun. What are your thoughts on that?
I am a big believer that horses enjoy the sport, hopefully as much as we do. And certainly if you look at the top levels of the sport, if you're jumping 160, if you're jumping around 5-star events, or if you're trotting around in the Grand Prix dressage, the horses that are competing in those sports, you know, certainly on the cross country, you have to have a horse that enjoys being challenged, feels fulfilled being challenged. And the horses that I'm competing at that level, I do genuinely believe, spending day in, day out with them, when I get onto a cross-country course and come out the start box, I do genuinely believe that they enjoy it. The horses that Sarah, my other half, competes in the dressage, we have some horses, quite a few of the dressage horses, that genuinely love dressage. I mean, I'm an event rider, so I can't quite understand that psychology, but but they live for trotting around in circles, and they really enjoy it. And so obviously there are horses out there who are less motivated or perhaps don't enjoy it so much. But when you look at the top levels of the sport, I don't think there's any chance that they would get there, because I think the horse's temperament and mentality and ambition is as important as their physical talent. Lower down the levels, I guess there is more opportunity, is the wrong word, but opportunity for horses to be used and abused in some way, and perhaps either pushed out of their comfort zone or asked to do things that perhaps they don't enjoy as much as the rider is. And I guess that's a thorny ethical question for Maddie to explore. But certainly at the top level of sport, I would struggle to believe that the horses are not enjoying it in some way. And I guess enjoyment is humanizing their experience. But I guess we do have to frame it in some way, and I think enjoyment is as good a way as any.
Thanks, Alex. Now,
so can I chip in there?
Yeah, go on.
100% Alex on that. I've been involved with horses a long time, and whether it's Alex's top level jumping 160 or whether it's a small child in the 12-hander jump round a show jumping class, you see ponies light up. And the only thing I would say is sometimes the pony doesn't know that it not to jump down. It's just as happy when it finishes as whether it was clear or full faults. But definitely some horses, especially in eventing, light up when they go on the course.
I mean, I think we're getting into an area of work, you know, around behavioural ethograms and actually listening to what our horses are telling us. That we've covered it in previous webinars, and we certainly will in future. Now, we're getting towards the end. We've still got lots of questions. So I'm going to ask the panellists just to up the ante and just keep the answers as short as possible. Obviously, I'll just fire simple questions at you, like this one, Maddie from Siobhan. What are your views on horses having undergone a neurectomy to continue their athletic career?
My view on this comes back very much to what Alex said, that we have to be extremely conscious of whether by performing that surgery, we're making it more likely that the horse will sustain a serious injury.
Yeah. So thank you. Mel's asked, Alex, tack fit and safety at competition. Do you think this should be checked at all levels?
I haven't had my tack checked in terms of fit since Pony Club. But I don't think that that's necessarily feasible, and I don't think it's necessarily necessary. I think for Pony Club and for lower levels of the sport, possibly. But I mean, how I can't see how you would necessarily police that. Saddle fit, as we know, is an art rather than a science. It's open to interpretation. I don't see how that would work.
Fine, but obviously, and again, it comes back to education, doesn't it? Sorry, Maddie, were you going to jump in there? No. Dorothy's asked, John, how much do you feel there's too much emphasis on opportunity for competing at the expense of the solid establishment of the foundation of training and a good relationship with the horse?
Quite a lot, actually. I think we should train more and complete less, personally. I think you have to, the skills of training, there's quite a lot of things that are quick, people think are going to be quick fixes with horses, whether that's tack or some things they'll maybe do training method wise, but there's not actually any, I don't think there's any personally quick fix essentially for a horse. It's partnership between horse and rider. Maybe that's a rider getting more educated in how they're going to school their horses, but essentially it's long, hard work, hard days to do that.
Thank you, John. Alex, Lisa's asked, how come the biggest stars can keep overbending their horses in the warm-up and dressage arenas, even under the overview of stewards and judges? How can we make the actual rules to comply?
I mean, I'm in eventing. You don't see roll cur at all nowadays. I remember warming up 12 years ago in the main arena in Beijing. Well, it was in Hong Kong, the Olympics, and there were riders training in genuine old-fashioned roll cur, which at the time was allowed. And I think nowadays you see it very rarely, and I would say stewards on the whole are pretty good at stopping it at the time. I think dressage has a huge issue with roll cur. I think not necessarily in that it's happening so often, but I think it has a huge PR issue and a huge issue systemically. And it has to solve this issue, because I think it is really damaging to the sport going forwards. But having said that, you know, in eventing and in other sports, it's not something you see very often. And I think certainly in eventing, the eventing stewards are very hot on it.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Knowing Sarah and your partner, I know that's a challenging discussion topic.
I think Sarah very much agrees, so I don't think that's an issue.
Yes, I'm sure so. Maddie, Sue's asked, I'm an endurance rider and our horses are vetted before, during and after an event. Would this be a way of ensuring better equine welfare in other sports?
It's interesting. I was having this conversation with someone just the other day about buying horses, actually. And of course, when you go to buy an endurance horse, you can see that record very clearly, you know, which is a real help, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think veterinary checks at appropriate stages, and that will depend upon the sport, clearly, can only help to improve welfare.
Brilliant. And Alex, who's that? Lisa, thank you for answering her question, and she also loves your cat. John,
it's a dog. It's a dog.
It's a dog. Okay, there we go. I didn't think I saw a cat. Jane's asked, John, should people have to have a certificate of competence before they're allowed to have a horse?
Oh, thorny issue. I don't think you should really need a certificate of confidence, but definitely you should. I think education is first and foremost. If you're going to get an animal of any kind, whether it's a dog or a horse or whatever you want, you have to be proactive and actually learn a little bit about it before you get it. I think you start going down the lines of certificates, it's a bit difficult, but I think going forward with equestrian sport, we have to be mindful of the fact that what's good welfare, not just for the horse world, but for the general public overall. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Still lots of questions coming in, but I think we're going to have to start drawing a close. Ellen has asked, and Maddie, I'll come to you on this, but I'm sure the others might have love their view as well. A lot of the social license concept is about public perception. What can all riders do to help, such as on their own social media channels?
That's a really good question, isn't it? And I think probably just promoting positive practice, making it obvious that we are thinking about these issues. I think that's a large part of it. So, you know, events like the one this evening, when we've been able to have a very frank discussion, which helps to inform all of our practice. You know, all of that I think can help to engage with the public and explain why we're doing what we're doing and the fact that we are taking great care over it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Alex, Lindsay's asked, do you think that learned helplessness, or I mean, basically horses that have given up the spirit, is prevalent in high-performing sport horses? Are they just robots?
Absolutely not. Totally not. Certainly in high-level sport horses, it's not possible to jump a course of 160, jump a 5-star track, or to trot and canter around a Grand Prix test without the horse wanting to do it with you. It's not possible to get to that level, and it's not possible to do it without the horse wanting to do it in a partnership with you. But you definitely couldn't ride a horse that was not self-motivated around a 5-star event like badminton. And you know, the demand, even in the dressage, you know, I think quite a lot of the public perception of dressage is that horses are robots and treated like robots, and they're really not. The demands that the training and the test requires means that the horse has to be extremely self-motivated.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. And last question from Sally. John, is it ethical to ride a horse who shows no enthusiasm or even a negative attitude towards being ridden?
I'm getting all the good ones tonight.
Yeah.
Depends what her negative attitude might be my positive one. Who knows? I think sometimes you have to let a horse be a horse. Maybe it's a wee bit stale. Maybe he just needs turned away for a few months, put in a field and taking the shoes off and just come back to what it wants to be. You have to give him a break. Well, Alex level, they're elite athletes. I'm sure he still gives them breaks if they've got niggles and sore bits at that level. But even horses that are happy hackers, they still need a wee break, turn them away. Maybe they'll come back into work and be a bit more positive.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you to all three of you. I'm looking at the answers or the questions, we've got through over half, but I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to all of them. But thank you so much for being so engaged. I hope we've got through a good representation of them. Before I ask, so just for some final thoughts from our three brilliant panelists, just to remind you, if you've got thoughts on what we might cover in future webinars, then please do send through your thoughts to education@worldhorsewelfare.org. I have this nagging feeling that I've forgotten to say something as well, and I'm sure the team are going to tell me afterwards. I'm going to try and remember what those are. And whilst I do that, I'm just going to come to each of the panelists, and for your we've covered a lot of ground as ever. What are your final thoughts? John, I'll come to you first.
Final thoughts from the equestrian sports side for me is, I think the equestrian industry it's not a sleeping giant, but it's definitely slumbering at the moment, and it could do with being woken up a wee bit. We've got an opportunity to going forward to really bolster equine sport in the nation's mind, because it's an inclusive sport. Men and women compete as equals. It's great mental health, well-being for the horse and the owners. I think we've got a great chance and opportunity, whether that's going to government looking for more facilities, coaching, education, to really put equestrian sport back in the map.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's so encouraging to hear from the likes of the British Horse Society and others that actually riding schools since lockdown, they're busier than ever, which is a wonderful thing to see. And as you say, we need those facilities and need to promote that as well. Alex, final thoughts from you.
I think as a horse sport industry and as a community, we should have a huge amount of confidence that the vast majority of the horses that are in our care do enjoy the highest level of welfare, both practically and ethically. I think the vast majority of riders do really care about their horses and really do put their horses' welfare above other potentially conflicting interests, such as performance and finance, or at least on the same level. But in a ever-changing social media world, we have to continue to challenge how it is that our sport is perceived in the broader world. We have to continually think about our social license. Every rider, every groom, every owner has to be an ambassador for the sport in a positive way. We have to continue to promote horsemanship and the values of horsemanship in a positive way. And we have to continually challenge the growing or ever-changing welfare issues that the sport encounters as the sports evolve. And I think it's just an ongoing discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Before I come to Maddie, just to remind you that our third webinar in this series over the summer is going to take place next month on July the 28th, starting at 7 p.m. And that's how to restrain horses appropriately. And we've got Dr. Gemma Pearson, got Brad Hill from the University of Nottingham, and also World Horse Welfare's Tony Evans joining us for that. We've got a link there for you to sign up, so I hope you can join us then. Maddie, what are your take-home thoughts?
Well, I concur with everything that John and Alex have just said, really. And, I do, having spent a considerable period of time thinking about it, do firmly believe that we can make clear ethical justifications for the use of horses in sport. But, at the core of that is everyone within the equine industries being very proactive about identifying welfare issues and doing what we can to address them. And so, this event this evening has been wonderful to have people engaged in this conversation, to have World Horse Welfare organising it, and to have to be able to hear thoughts from Alex and John. All of that, I think, is very important and is the way forward.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you. And on behalf of the University of Nottingham and World Horse Welfare, it's been brilliant to have you all join us tonight. Thank you for your questions. As I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but it was brilliant to have so many and so many different questions and such a variety. And it only then leaves me to thank Maddie, Alex, and John, especially Alex, to you, wishing you the best of luck over the next few weeks. I know you've got one or two things on, so the fact that your time with us tonight is even better. So we wish you the very best of luck, and to thank you to everyone. Hopefully see you at the end of July when we're talking about how we can best restrain our horses. In the meantime, take great care. I always say, I don't think we've got any Southern Hemisphere people with us today, so I can say enjoy the summer wherever you are. As you can see, John and I are appropriately dressed for a British summer, Scottish or Cambridge. So there you go. Thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.